By the time I got back to my apartment in River North, still carrying the clean chill of a donor dinner, Blake had already turned my living room into a stage with a ring light burning against my walls and his phone raised toward his face like he was about to baptize himself in other people's attention. He looked into the screen with that polished, weightless confidence of his and said, "Tonight I'm finally cutting dead weight out of my life," while comments raced upward and strangers warmed themselves on a story he had not earned the right to tell. Then he turned the phone toward me, smiling like I was the reveal, and I saw the boxed lock set near his knee and one of my own weekender bags already packed by my own door. I stopped just inside the room and let the silence stay with me, because the sight of my bag sitting there told me this had not grown out of an argument. It had been planned, arranged, and rehearsed until he believed performance could replace fact. Blake mistook my stillness for shock and told his audience, "She's been living off my energy long enough. And tonight she's out." It's saying it in that smooth, expensive tone he used whenever he wanted, borrowed things to sound like proof. All I could think was how many times he had stood in my kitchen, under my lights, against my windows, and let people believe the life framing him belonged to him. When he crouched by the door and lifted the lock set slightly for the camera, like a little trophy, he expected them to cheer. I took out my phone and called Raymond downstairs. I kept my voice level and said, "I need you upstairs now. He's live, and he's trying to change the locks." And that calm seemed to amuse Blake more than if I had screamed. He glanced over with a small laugh and asked, "You're really calling security on me in my own place?" And I answered, "No, Blake, I'm calling security to mine." That landed somewhere behind his eyes, but not deeply enough to stop him. And he turned back to the stream and said, "See what I mean? This is exactly why she has to go." While reaching for the screwdriver like motion itself could keep the lie alive. I leaned against the wall and watched him kneel at a door he had never signed for, never paid for, never had any right to touch. And for the first time since I had known him, I felt something colder than hurt. I felt the exact second before a man walks straight into the collapse of his own version of reality. I was not surprised because Blake had been practicing for that moment, long before he touched my door, long before he lifted his phone, long before he decided humiliation would look good on him. I met him at a private arts fundraiser in the West Loop, where people with real money rarely perform. And he stood out because he talked like a man auditioning for power instead of carrying any. At the time, I mistook that shine for substance. Because confidence is easy to romanticize when it arrives dressed well and looks directly at you. My life already had shape before he entered it. A River North apartment I had secured on my own. A serious job in donor relations. And a routine built from discipline instead of noise. Blake slipped into that life, the way certain men do. First as company after late dinners, then with a toothbrush, then with clothes in my closet, and always with language designed to make each step feel natural. Whenever I brought up leases, bills, or anything that separated affection from legal fact, he would smile against my kitchen counter and murmur that paperwork was for people who did not trust what they had. The changes came slowly enough to make denial feel reasonable, which was exactly how he liked things. He started coming home late, then later than that, carrying a trace of perfume that did not belong to me. And when I held his gaze too long, he would soften his voice and ask whether I really thought so little of him. Then his phone began living face down. Passwords changed without warning. Calls ended when I entered a room, and each small interruption left the same aftertaste. Not proof yet, but the feeling that reality was being edited inside my own home. What turned suspicion into something colder was the way he began attaching himself to the apartment, like repetition could manufacture ownership. He posted photos under my windows, beside my bar cart, near the art I had paid for, and captioned them with phrases like, "my view" and "my place" before a big week, letting strangers build a story around him while he stood inside rooms I had secured years before I knew his name. That was when I stopped asking whether he was only cheating, because cheating was ugly enough. But this was a different kind of hunger. A man trying to wear my stability like it had always been tailored for him. By then, I was no longer asking what Blake felt, only what he thought he could take if I kept apologizing for noticing him. Every late return, every polished caption, every moment he let borrowed space pass as earned success pushed me toward the same hard truth, that he did not want to belong to the life I had built. He wanted to stand in the center of it and call that his rise. So when I walked in and saw the ring light, the lock set, and my bag by the door, I did not feel shock at all. Only recognition. Once I understood Blake was trying to stand in the center of my life and call that success, I stopped chasing reassurance and started collecting proof. Because instinct had already done its job and now evidence had to do the rest. I hired a private investigator through a contact Abigail trusted, paid for discretion instead of drama. And within 3 days, I had photographs of Blake leaving a boutique hotel with a woman I had never seen before. In one frame, his hand was at the small of her back. In another, his mouth was on hers outside a restaurant I knew from the charge that had appeared on our shared card 2 nights earlier. Her name was Talia Greer. And what unsettled me was not just that Blake was sleeping with her, but the way they moved like people already working from the same page. The investigator sent over timestamps, entry logs, and a short note that they had met more than once at places chosen for privacy. Polished enough for appearances, hidden enough for deniability. I stared at those photos in my office with my heartbeat suddenly clean and cold. Because accidents do not repeat themselves with reservations. Ride receipts. And the same practiced body language twice in 1 week. Then another layer surfaced. And it made the cheating look almost ordinary by comparison. I found a campaign deck open on Blake's laptop one morning after he left for coffee. And there was my living room. My windows. My bar cart. Positioned as background for the luxury persona he had been pitching to sponsors. He had labeled one slide home authority and another private space. Aspirational, masculine calm. And there was Talia's name in the notes section beside a line about post-breakup audience acceleration, which was the moment I understood she was not a surprise. Not collateral, not a stupid side choice, but part of the architecture. A week later, I heard her voice for myself when Blake took a call in the hall outside the bathroom and thought the shower covered everything worth hiding. She was talking fast, practical, already inside the math of damage and attention. And when she said, "If you do it, live. Keep it clean and keep control," I felt something inside me settle with terrifying precision. He murmured back that once the breakup content landed, the brand meetings would feel bigger, the apartment would read cleaner, and people would finally see him the way he had always wanted to be seen. That was when I called Abigail and stopped speaking to Blake like he still deserved the benefit of confusion. She told me to save everything. Freeze my credit. Export statements. Preserve screenshots. And let a man who loved performance keep performing until he crossed fully into documentation. So by the time I walked into that room and saw the ring light, the lock set, and my packed bag by the door, I already knew his affair had never been a lapse in character at all. It had been a strategy stitched to optics, money, and the theft of a life he had not built. Blake took my stillness for surrender and smiled into his phone like the room had already chosen him. Then lifted the lock set and said, "Watch how easy it is to remove chaos." The comments kept racing, bright and eager. And he let them feed him the way they always did. Shoulders squared, voice smooth, acting like public approval could become ownership. Then he crouched by my door, set the screwdriver into the hardware, and added, "She had chance after chance to get it together. But some people only learn when nice ends." I stayed where I was, close enough to see his hand slip once when the first screw resisted. And that mattered more than his voice because metal does not flatter delusion. He glanced at me with that polished half-smile and asked whether I wanted to make this harder on myself. But he was already speaking past me, chasing the stream. I let him keep talking because each sentence pushed him deeper into a version of reality that could not survive records. Access logs, lease files, or the building itself. The knock came sharp and clean, and when I opened the door, Raymond stood there with the resident tablet in one hand and a second staff member just behind him. Blake rose too quickly, phone still raised, and tried to seize the frame before it shifted, saying, "Perfect timing. I need her removed. She's refusing to leave." Raymond did not answer him first. He looked at me, then at the lockset box, the screwdriver, my packed bag by my own door, and stepped inside. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked, and Blake rushed in before silence could expose him, saying this was his residence and he was changing the locks. Raymond glanced down at the tablet, then back at Blake, and replied, "The resident of record for this apartment is Marin Ellison, and no other occupant is authorized to alter entry hardware." The room changed on that line before Blake even processed it, because I saw the first fracture on his face and then in the reflection of his own screen. He laughed once, thin and fast, and said we lived there together. Everybody knew that. But Raymond answered with the same calm, "Living here as a guest is not tenancy." That word landed harder than accusation ever could, and I stepped forward just enough to say, "You were never on the lease." Blah, Blake. Not on rent. Not on utilities. Not anywhere. He turned toward me like I had betrayed some private agreement by speaking plainly, and for the first time that night I saw panic under the shine. "Tell him I live here," he pushed out, but the sentence already sounded smaller than the stream he had built around it. I held his eyes and said, "You stayed here. You posted here. You performed here. But none of that made this yours," while Raymond moved closer to the door. Then Raymond told him to put the tool down, stop tampering with building hardware, and prepare to collect his belongings because he no longer had permission to remain there that night. Blake looked at the phone, then at the door, then back at me like he was searching for the version of me who used to rescue him from the consequences of his own arrogance. Instead, I watched him lower the screwdriver, watched the comments turn, and watched the stream stay live long enough to catch the exact second his narrative stopped breathing. When he finally ended the live, there was no closing line. No swagger left, only silence. And as he packed 2 suitcases under the weight of his own collapse, I understood the worst part for him was not being removed. It was realizing nobody had watched me break. By morning, the clip had outrun the building and whatever lie Blake thought he could still save with one more smooth explanation. His followers had watched him call my apartment his, watched Raymond correct him once, and now strangers were pulling apart months of posts that suddenly looked stolen. Every caption about my view, every frame from my kitchen, every polished shot against my windows had become proof that Blake had not built a life, only borrowed one. Talia called before noon, and what hit me first was not guilt, but irritation. The voice of a woman forced to touch a mess she expected to stay elegant. She did not apologize, did not ask whether I was all right, and did not pretend she had just learned about me. She only said, "He went too far." I let that sit until she added that things were supposed to be handled privately after, and that one word, supposed, told me enough. I asked how long she had known about me, and she answered like someone annoyed by being cornered with a fact she had already discounted. She said Blake told her I would be out soon, that the apartment was basically his, and that once the split went public, everything else would settle. Hearing her use the same ownership language he had used on the live stream locked the last loose piece into place. Because they were not improvising. They were executing a plan. That afternoon, I opened the files Abigail had told me to preserve and looked at them without blinking. The deck, the account alerts, the statements, the polished trail. Blake had not only wanted me gone, he had wanted my address, my rooms, my aesthetic, my stability, and the world attached to my work, all relabeled. Worse than the cheating and worse than the stream was the clean logic underneath it. Because once he believed he could wear my life convincingly enough, He believed he could use my identity too. By evening, Abigail had me freezing accounts, documenting the unauthorized credit activity, and pushing everything that mattered into folders built for consequence instead of heartbreak. One brand quietly stepped back from its meeting with Blake, and by then I did not need outrage to feel the shift, because the borrowed shine was already peeling. He had tried to throw me out in front of strangers, but what began ruining him was colder than humiliation, the record proving how much of him had never been his. 2 weeks later, Raymond called from the lobby and told me Blake was downstairs with his mother, and I looked at the boxes by my entryway like a final inventory of bad judgment. I had already packed everything that was clearly his. The clothes, the books, the grooming kits, and the loose objects he had spread through my apartment until temporary started impersonating permanent. I told Raymond to send them up but stay close. Because by then I understood that men like Blake rarely come back for belongings without also reaching for one last advantage. When I opened the door, Blake looked diminished in the specific way public failure shrinks, a man who had been surviving on projection, while Diane Sutton walked in wearing polish, anger, and inherited denial. She barely glanced at the boxes before telling me I had humiliated her son for the internet, and I answered that he had humiliated himself in my apartment with a screwdriver in his hand. Blake kept his eyes lowered while she stood there trying to turn a record into a misunderstanding. But nothing in that room was soft enough anymore to help them. She called it one ugly night. One mistake. One overreaction. And every phrase sounded thinner because the facts were already too organized to bend around family loyalty. I looked at Blake, then at the boxed-up remains of his stay, and told her it was not one night. It was the lock, the lies, the apartment, and the credit activity. That was the first moment Blake looked up, because hearing the fraud named out loud in front of his mother landed harder than the live stream ever had. We carried the last of his things down in silence, and even that felt cleaner than any of the conversations we had while I was still trying to save something. He was busy converting into leverage. At the curb, he finally said he was sorry for the cheating, the live stream, and the stories. But the apology sounded like a man listing damages rather than understanding what he had broken. I did not argue, because remorse without repair is only another attempt to make a woman hold the emotional weight he can no longer carry alone. After that, Abigail handled the rest the way real life in America usually gets handled. Through notices, disputes, passwords, records, and a police report plain enough to sound boring until you remember what it means. Raymond filed the incident report. Building management barred Blake from returning without my permission, and the unauthorized credit activity stayed documented where it belonged. By the time Diane drove him away, what had really been taken from him was not a single viral moment, but every borrowed thing he had once mistaken for entitlement. 3 months later, the apartment feels like mine again in a way it did not even before Blake, because now every quiet thing inside it has been chosen twice and kept on purpose. I changed the locks properly, moved the furniture, replaced the art he used to stand in front of, and bought a plant that keeps leaning toward the same clean strip of morning light. The clip still surfaces sometimes, but it no longer feels like my life being discussed. Only a record of the night borrowed status collapsed the second it touched an actual file. Therapy helped me name what hurt most. And it was not only the cheating or the live stream, but the slow erosion of my trust in my own instincts. Once I understood that, healing stopped, looking soft, and started looking exact. Better sleep, cleaner choices, quieter rooms, and no patience left for men who need witnesses to feel real. I have gone on a few dates. Nothing serious. And that feels right, because peace reached me first. And I am no longer willing to reverse that order for anyone. Blake wrote me a letter last week. 3 pages in careful handwriting, admitting Talia was not the only one, and admitting he had used me for stability while chasing a shinier version of himself. I read it twice and threw it away without anger, because by then even his apology felt like another delayed performance. Too late. too polished, and no longer relevant to my life. That was the strangest victory of all. Not that he finally understood what he had done, but that his understanding no longer had the power to move anything inside me. What remains now is simple and more than enough. A home that feels honest, a life that fits, and the calm that comes after you stop carrying someone who mistook access for love. He thought he was going to make me the punchline, but all he really did was prove that a man can stand in your light for years and still leave with nothing of it. Thank you for staying with me through this story. And if any part of it felt familiar, I hope you choose peace early. Trust yourself faster, and believe a kinder life is still waiting for you.